As Dante and Virgil wander through the hell of the heretics, a voice sounds from one of the fiery tombs which halts them, and like a man whose legend precedes him, Farinata emerges from the flames of his own tomb, and Dante says, "My eyes were already fixed on his, as he lifted his chest and forehead as if he thought hell was nothing." This Farinata looks at Dante. Studying me a while, looking almost scornful, he asks, "Who were your people?" Farinata is scornful before he is informed that Dante is a member of the adverse party. "Who were your people?" he asks, as in which side were you on in the bitter struggle in Tuscany between Ghibellines and Guelphs? Dante was a Guelph. Farinata was a Ghibelline. Here in the heretic circle, were we expecting theological differences or political differences? Because political differences is what we're going to get. And isn't that interesting? What is the story with Farinata? Well, Farinata lived before Dante. Dante was 2 when Farinata was killed. And Farinata was posthumously convicted of heresy. They dug up his dead body nearly 20 years after his death, put it on trial, and hanged it. Coincidentally, it meant the disinheritance of his heirs and the seizure of his estate. What is going on here? Your political opponent is a heretic. How do we feel about this? Dante, a member of one political faction, quick to believe the slanders that have been assigned to his political opponent. My question, who should go here? This is a place where you stick the dissent, correct? Who should be put here? And I say it's perfect. The end result of evil creeds, you would think, would be evil deeds. That the heretic section exists, however, it seems to imply that it must be filled with people whose deeds were insufficiently evil to place them somewhere else. This, therefore, is a place for the wrong. Worse, it is a place for the ideologically wrong. Let us therefore accuse Dante of pettiness, but then see if we might not be able to exonerate him. He allows Farinata to defend himself. When Farinata says, responding to the accusation that there was a great deal of bloodshed between these two parties, Farinata responds, "It wasn't only me. Besides, I didn't join in without reason, and it was I alone, when the rest agreed to Florence's destruction, I alone who stood out for her." And what that is reference to is the fact that when Farinata's side had won at the Battle of Monteperti, he had to convince his fellow Ghibellines not to completely raze the city of Florence. So here is Farinata making this statement, and Dante doesn't respond. Well, we'll see how he responds. Dante doesn't negate the statement. He allows him to make it. The statement's subtext is, "In a violent world, I was a little better than everyone else. What more could you want from me?" And Dante's next sentence is, "So your seed finds rest someday. Untie me a knot." That is a sympathetic segue into the next question he is going to ask. The other thing that I think is interesting as we get into this comment, more talk about heresy. These lines when Dante asks, "Who else is here?" Line 118 of Canto 10, Farinata says, "I lie with over 1,000 here. There's the Cardinal, Frederick II. The rest is silence." I want to talk about those words, "the rest is silence." If we take Farinata, Frederick II, and the Cardinal, the Ellis footnote says that the Cardinal is Ottaviano degli Ubaldini. We're taking 3 significantly powerful individuals who already had a reputation for heresy. Dante has not added one name to the list of heretics. He's contributed no name of his own. I think that's interesting. He merely concedes the flow of public opinion. He doesn't necessarily fight against it, but he also doesn't join it. He doesn't say, "Oh, this is our thing, we condemn heretics. Oh, let me add a few names myself." He doesn't engage in it. The rest is silence, as in, I will accuse none but those who have already been accused. Also, only the Epicureans are singled out specifically, and that is a creed that predates Christianity. So Dante does not take aim at any Christian heresies specifically. He mentions that there's various sects in Canto 9, but he doesn't take any specific aim at any of them, nor does he make any attempts to pick them apart theologically. You could also make the argument that by saying that Farinata has risen out of his furnace tomb as if hell were nothing, it's like Dante is making a concession to public opinion. Public opinion placed this heretic here in hell. And here he is, the dissenter, taking his punishment like a man. But now let's talk about the heresy of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. The Ellis footnote says he had a reputation as a heretic, and the Ellis footnote is absolutely correct. Of course Frederick II was considered a heretic. A little about him. He was raised in Palermo in Sicily. Now, Palermo in the 13th century was a decadent boom town. Back then, Rome had less than 40,000 inhabitants. These Italian cities are on the rise, but the grandeur of the Renaissance is in the future. But Palermo was different. Horny, conquering Normans were there. Arabs who had dusted off Aristotle and bringing Oriental wealth were there. These are the lines pertaining to 13th century Sicily from the historian Henry Dwight Sedgwick. The intellectual boy, that is Frederick, could not have been untouched by the prodigal beauty about him. Palermo sat like a coquette, glittering and gracious, tempting all comers to stay. Within the city, castles, palaces, churches, mosques, shops, and houses, gay in oriental colors and shapes ranged in picturesque succession. The streets were spacious, the alleys broad. The city itself was all life and bustle, color and gaiety. And the women, cloaked in their elegant mantles of silk enriched with gold embroidery, artfully veiled, odorous with sweet perfumes. Palermo was a Babylonian citadel of sin, excess, richness, and diversity of opinion. One poet wrote that the city was altera mellifluens paradisus. And that middle word turned to mellifluous in English. That's a Milton word to describe Eden. Mellifluous. He loves it. So being unable to take up a creed with the same fervor as its dumbest adherents is what makes a person look like a heretic. Pope Gregory excommunicated Frederick II for not going on a crusade. Then he excommunicated him a second time for going on one. The crusade ended in no battle. Instead, Frederick negotiated a corridor to the sea at Jaffa. He did reclaim Jerusalem, but his heresy was that Muslims retained possession of the holy places and were allowed to worship there. That's the heresy. The historian Ferdinand Schevel writes, brought up in southern Italy, where Christian and Muslim influences met and mixed, he had developed an intellectual skepticism which rendered him completely immune to the religious fervor characteristic of an age of faith. Both Dominicans and Franciscans instinctively sensed the emperor's intellectual emancipation and worked against him. They poured vials of their wrath over him as an Epicurean and a sensualist. Those words from Ferdinand Schevel, that's in his book on the history of Florence, that people can sense another person's intellectual emancipation. People sense when another person does not invoke the moral vocabulary that is current and fashionable. It makes people uncomfortable when you don't do that. A good example of this is even in the 19th century art world. So dispense with religion. It's everywhere. So even in the 19th century art world, there was a painter by the name of Frederick Leighton, who's an outstanding painter. But because he painted beautiful things, Victorian critics, and I'm quoting from an essay by Elizabeth Pritijon. And here's her quote. Victorian art critics frequently accused Leighton's paintings of seeming too perfect, of denying the inequalities of human experience. In an age where the moral imperative was not religious, but the moral imperative was Marxist and political and pertained to the rise of the worker, a work of art that made no acknowledgement to that whatsoever was heretical in their language. They'd cross out heretical, insert a heartless capitalist because he's painting a sleeping woman. Heretics are simply people who are not as fervent in picking up the moral imperative of the age. We saw that, by the way, back in Canto 9, when the Furies appeared on the wall. Virgil, to use Ferdinand Schevel's words, demonstrated his intellectual emancipation by rejecting the suggestion of the fallen angels. And there come the Furies to beat their chests over it.